Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God. Because many false prophets are gone out into the world, hereby you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. And every spirit that confesses not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. This is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof you have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. Now that's a kind of a strange statement in a way. When one reads the New Testament, especially if you just simply read through the gospel accounts, whether anyone should ever question that Jesus had come in the flesh seems a strange one indeed. And having read that little text, I could ask for a show of hands. Well, now, how many of you people believe that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh? Every hand goes up, because there's no way that you're going to sit out there, having heard that from John, and say, no, I don't believe that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. It's strange how things get going around, and there was an attitude, a spirit, a doctrine apparently that existed in John's own day that to some degree or in some way or in some fashion claimed that Jesus had not come in the flesh. John seems to have been singularly sensitive to this, and back in his gospel account, in the 11th chapter of John, we have one of the great examples or illustrations of the fact that Jesus came in the flesh. In a way, a sort of surprising thing in a way, and yet very important. I don't even know that John included this chapter, this passage, or the events of this chapter for this reason, but very much they are here. It says, Now a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sister sent to Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. Now, didn't Jesus love everyone? In a broad sense, I am sure that he did. There can be hardly any question about that. But there's not much doubt about it, that when you read this, that this is going to a different level when he says, he whom you love is sick. Now when Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. Now the statement made, as his disciples heard it, would have seemed unremarkable, I think. He said, this sickness is not unto death. His disciples said, then he knows that Lazarus isn't going to die, because he's going to go back in time and heal him. But of course, Lazarus did die. Yet Jesus said, this sickness is not unto death, thereby raising a rather strange conundrum for his disciples when they began to face up to this thing. Then it said further, Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. As I said earlier, he loved everybody. Why then does it specifically say that he loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus? Actually, what's one interesting little play on words, and one that you may be familiar with from earlier sermonettes or sermons, when it talks about the little conversation between Jesus and Peter, where Jesus said to Peter, Do you love me? And Peter said, Of course, Lord, I love you. In the King James, you don't notice the fact that Jesus uses one word for love and Peter uses another. Jesus is asking about agape. Peter comes back with phileo. Do you really love me? Do you really prefer me above all others? Because the agape love actually is the kind of love a man should have for his wife. It is the love to prefer above all others. Phileo, as a love, is basically close to our word affection. And we have a broad circle of people for whom we have affection, and we have a much narrower circle of people whom we really prefer above others. Now, there's nothing in the world wrong with that. In the course of human events, all of us have friends. All of us have people to whom we feel closer than we do to anybody else on the face of the earth. There are people that we trust more than we trust other people. They are our own familiar friend with whom we take sweet counsel together, whom we can talk to into the small hours of the night, whom we can explain anything that's on our mind, whom we can share any thought, with whom we can can share our deepest fears and our deepest hopes and those things that we're afraid of, those things that we hope for, those things that we dread, those things that we worry about. There are people that we can talk to about those things, and there are people to whom we cannot talk about them. And so, when we speak of preferring above others, Mary comes and says, well, he for whom you have affection is sick. But when it comes a little further, John says, now Jesus loved or preferred above others Martha and her sister and Lazarus. These were people with whom he was singularly and specially close. Now, the reason why I think this is important is because we like to, I think, without realizing what we are doing, keep God at a distance. There is the song, of course, God is watching us. He's watching us, but He's watching us from a distance. And that's the way, by and large, that people like it. When Jesus came down and put His feet on the Mount of Olives, and all of the mountains smoked and quaked, and earth quaked, and rocks rent and rolled down the mountainside, the people pulled away from that and said, oh no, Moses, you go up and speak to God. We don't want to talk to Him. You speak to Him lest we die. And so they withdrew when the chance came to actually be close and to experience God and to hear His voice rolling down the mountainside. They were afraid of it. There is, I think, in us, without being perhaps able to admit it, a willingness to allow God to stay at a distance and to not have quite the close and personal relationship with God that might be there, that might be possible. But of course, God is so much greater than we are, and Jesus, being God, sort of operated at a higher level than any of us and would not be touched by the mundane things of existence like you and I would, right? That things that bother us wouldn't bother Him. Things that you and I are afraid of, He might not be afraid of. Things that we might hope for, He might not hope for. That if that were the true, then the kind of relationships that develop between us would never develop between Jesus and people. That He basically would have an even relationship with people. That there would be no special relationships with special people. There would be no one out there that Jesus would find it easier to talk to than to someone else. And you have to understand that a lot of this question of the ease of talking to people and of the trust that comes back to you from people, these are the things upon which these relationships are based. And somehow a relationship was developed between these three and Jesus that did not exist between Jesus and many other people who knew Him and knew Him fairly well. Now, when you read this, he says, when he heard therefore that Lazarus was sick, he stayed 2 days longer in the same place where he was. He made no move. Now, that's not difficult to understand, at least as we make our way into the story. Lazarus is sick. Put yourself in the position of Peter, who's wandering along in his footsteps and hears him say, oh no, Lazarus is not going to die. This is just a chance for me to be glorified again. A day passes and we don't start south. Peter would simply say, well, I guess Lazarus isn't that bad. Another day passes. They still don't start south. Well, Lazarus isn't that bad. After that, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. This is where Lazarus lived, not far outside of Jerusalem. And his disciples said to him, Master, the Jews of late were trying to kill you, and you're going to go there again? They weren't really altogether sure about this sequence of events. I don't know what went through their mind about the reasons for Jesus' delay. We're not told. But they did understand that there was good reason not to go back into Judea. It was a very dangerous place to be. Then Jesus answered, and I want you to ask yourself a question as we read through these next two verses. Why does this come in here? And what does this have to do with anything that's been said up until this point? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in a day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbles not because he sees the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbles because there is no light in him. Well, of course. It's day outside. You can walk outside and you can miss that little brick retaining wall. You're not going to walk around and stumble and walk off the edge of it because you can see it. It's right there. It's in plain view. You're not going to walk into the trees or the pillars outside the building because they're there. You can see them, right? Any fool knows that. And of course, if it's all dark outside and there are no lights on, you can go blundering straight into a tree, straight into somebody's car sitting out there and hurt yourself. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, back up to the preceding verse. First, Jesus says, I think I need to go to Judea again. The disciples said, now, you do remember that the Jews down there were just last time you were there were trying to stone you. Are you sure you want to go there again? Now, if you take Jesus' comment and assume that he's completely addressing what they're saying, Jesus said, are there not 12 hours in a day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbles not, because he sees the light of this world. If you'll just page back to John, the 9th chapter, and verse 4. Jesus said, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. The sense in which Jesus responds to them says, look, there are only 12 hours in a day. There is a limited amount of time in which I have to get the work done. Just because my life is in danger going back there does not mean I should not go. I have a limited amount of time in which to work. So far, so good. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbles because there is no light in him. Well, now, true, there is no light in us. That without an external light source, we can't light up trees, obstacles, and this type of thing. But what, again, does this have to do with anything? I think what Jesus is saying to the disciples is that the obligation that is upon me to do what has to be done has a limited amount of time to be doing it. And if a man is going to do it, he's got to do it when the opportunity is there. On the other hand, if a man walk in the night, and what he is saying there is that for me to stay here would be the equivalent of a man walking in the night. It would be a failure to move. It would be a failure to proceed. It would be a failure to do what I have to do. And therefore I would fail in carrying out the responsibility that God has given me to do. It's a strange expression. It falls awkwardly in its place. But when you understand, I think, what Jesus had said before and what he was basically on about, it makes sense. These things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. There's every indication here that Jesus was waiting for this. Message came, Lazarus is sick. He said, I know, but he's not. This sickness is not unto death, but that I may be glorified in them. And he did not go back. A day passed, and he did not go back. Another day passed, and he did not go back. And then he knew that Lazarus had died. And he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. They said, well, now wait a minute. The Jews were going to stone you down there. Are you sure you want to go back? Jesus says, I've only got a limited amount of time in which I'm going to do this work that I've done. It would be wrong for me not to go back. And our friend Lazarus is sleeping. And I'm going to go and I'm going to wake him out of sleep. It's really clear what's happened here. The message came. He deliberately delayed. He knew then that Lazarus had died. And he made the decision, now I'm going to go back down to Judea and raise him from the dead. Which was going to be what the result of what he did. The disciples said, well, Lord, if he's sleeping and he's doing well, he must be getting better. You know, sleep is a healer. And the presumption that he had dropped off to sleep. It's interesting that it did not even occur to Jesus' disciples to wonder about his statement. How do you know he's sleeping? But they just knew. But he said he will do it well. And Jesus, however, spoke of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there to the intent that you may believe. Nevertheless, let's go to him. Then said Thomas, who is called Didymus, to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. You know, I have a note in my margin that I wrote from somebody's sermon in years gone by. This Bible is nearly 30 years old, so I have no idea when it was or how it got there, that says, note the vanity. I looked at it this morning, or actually it was last night when I was looking at this, and I said to myself, what an unfair analysis of this man. I have no way of knowing that. I have no way of saying that he was just saying, well, let's go die with him. Because it may have been. They assumed that he would go back there and be killed. And Jesus had said, let us go. So he expected them to go with him. Thomas spoke up and said, let's also go, that we may die with him. I think Thomas meant it right from the heart of his being. I do not think it was a question of any more vanity than human beings are normally afflicted with. I think it was a courageous statement on his part. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days by the time he actually got back already. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off, and many of the Jews came to Mary and Martha to comfort them concerning their brother. And Martha, as soon as she heard Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary stayed in the house. Then said Martha to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You know, that statement I don't think was intended by Martha in the least bit as a reproach to Jesus. But nevertheless, it must have been a painful thing. But she followed up with a statement. But I know that even now, whatsoever you will ask of God, God will give it to you. And Jesus said, your brother shall rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Martha had complete confidence in the resurrection. There was no question in her mind that she would see Lazarus again. There was no fear for Lazarus' eternal destiny. There was no fear about him going to hell or about him rotting away in the grave and never being heard from again. None of that was there. She knew all that. And yet she was profoundly grieved and still came to Jesus to say, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Any time it seems that we are praying about a sickness, be it our own or be it someone else's, the primary concern that we have, that thing that is always there, is that we don't want to die. Oh yeah, I'd like to be rid of the discomfort. Yes, I would like to get over the pain. Yeah, I'd like for the dizziness and the weak feelings to pass. Yes, I would like to be able to get up and walk on out of here, but I really don't want to die. It's right there as the dominant consideration, and there's almost a presumption in our minds and hearts that somehow or other, if every prayer is answered, if we can pray and ask God and every prayer is answered, maybe we won't have to die. Maybe we can just go on and on and on. I don't know how old Lazarus was, whether or not he was an older man or a younger man or what have you. But there was a presumption on their parts that if Jesus had been there, he would have just touched him or taken his hand and picked him up or put everybody out of the room and then laid hands on him and just healed him. Just like that. And the sequence of events here, you know, Jesus is even capable, everybody understood this, that someone has just died in a matter of hours ago. He can come in and he can raise that person back from the dead. It seems as though in this occasion, Jesus was determined to demonstrate something way beyond that. Now we're not talking about somebody that we're resuscitating. We're not talking about somebody the body has barely gotten cold. We're talking about someone who is 4 days dead. The body has begun to rot. The blood has pooled in the bottom of the carcass and has begun to coagulate into rot. There are places where things are beginning to come apart and the body's beginning to smell terrible. That long we have to wait on this particular occasion to accomplish what needs to be done. She knew she would see Lazarus again, but she felt that would be remote, away, far off in the future. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. She saw a resurrection that was remote, whereas the resurrection was standing in front of her. The resurrection was there. She could grab hold of his feet when she fell down in front of him. The resurrection was there. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said, "Yes, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world." You know, she sidestepped that question ever so slightly, didn't she? He said, "Do you believe this?" She said, "Yes, I believe that you are the Christ that should come into the world." That's not quite the same as saying, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, who is dead, shall live. He that believes in me is alive, shall not die. Do you believe this?" "Well, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, that should come into the world." And when she had so said, she went her way and called Mary, her sister, secretly, saying, "The Master is come, and he asks for you." As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus was not yet come into the town, but was in that place where Martha met him. He stayed there and sent for Mary from that location rather than coming right on down. The Jews then that were in the house and comforted her, when they saw Mary that she got up quickly and went out, they followed her and said, "Well, she's going to the grave to weep there." And just like, families will all get up from the house and go out to the cars and they'll drive down to the funeral home and they will sit, around the casket to see visitors that come. They just assumed that she was going over there. When Mary was come where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Exactly the same statement. There had to be, in a sense, a little reproach. Although I know they would have not meant it or not wanted it to be that way. They had sent for Jesus, and Jesus had delayed and not come. It almost looked like neglect. It almost looked like carelessness. And yet every indication is here. He could have left when the message got there, and he would have still been late. He would have died. But he was there doing the work of God. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. Now, I don't know what you think about when you read that verse. It's probably one of the best known verses in the Bible. It's a childish quiz. What's the shortest verse in the Bible? Shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. Why do you suppose he wept? Once upon a time, you have to remember, Jesus knew that he was going to raise this man from the dead in a matter of moments. It could not possibly have been the normal grieving that people do at the loss of a loved one, could it? The loss where, in Mary and Martha's case, they still had absolute confidence they would see Lazarus again. They just felt that it was going to be way out there somewhere. And Jesus said, "No, I am the resurrection. I am here." And yet Jesus himself, being there and knowing what he was going to do, he also wept. I've heard it said that, Jesus wept because of the hardness of their heart, or because of their lack of faith or belief, or whatever it was that was going on in these people. I remember when my mother died, I was there. I had driven down, I got to the hospital and had gone back and forth to the motel where I was staying a little bit, and they called me and I came over because they said that her vital signs were changing and they did not expect her to live much longer. She was 79. I was really reconciled to my mother's death. I felt curious about it in a way. It was a strange feeling that I did not feel more than I felt at the time. But I knew that my mother was 79. It was clear from my conversations with the doctor that my mother was not going to make it, that this was the time of her death, and that even though she was unconscious, it was obvious that her body was still suffering, and it was in my desire and my sister's desire that should not continue. And so we had signed the necessary papers, given the agreements that they would not go to heroic efforts of resuscitation. And I was there and watching the little monitor they have and the heartbeat that went by and the occasional irregularities of breathing and respiration. And again, feeling strangely detached about the whole thing. And, it's been 79 years since that woman brought me into the world, and we've known one another for all this time and cared for one another all this time. And I sat there kind of wondering about my own feelings at that time, because we had lived away from home for so long that the closeness that might have been there in years gone by had sort of dissipated. And then I noticed that the little monitor began to indicated her heartbeat was becoming slower and more irregular, and her blood pressure was dropping. And then after a few moments, it nearly stopped, and then started, and then stopped, and then started, and then the line went flat, and the little alarm went off, and the nurse came in to see to her. At that moment of time, I wept right uncontrollably from the core of my being, utterly without any ability to help myself at all. And I buried my face in my handkerchief. The nurse came over and put her hand on my shoulder. Knowing that someone is going to die, being all prepared for it, knowing that you're going to see them again, knowing that you have not lost them, knowing that they had a good life, knowing that they had all their grandchildren and had been able to do what she wanted to do, which was be near her grandchildren through all those remaining years. I could tick off all the things that I knew. I could tick off all the good things, all the right things, all the proper things, and all the reasons why I should be at peace about it. And yet I wept like a child at the death of my mother, and it is as it should be. Jesus comes to this scene where a man whom he loves deeply, a man with whom he has shared many hours of conversation, a man who really loved and liked Jesus, and when people really love you and care about you, you are more likely to respond and love and care about them. They would have been very, very close, as he was to their sisters. And he saw their weeping, and he saw the weeping of the other Jews around, and the awareness of the death of Lazarus came over Jesus. And with his mind, he knew what he was going to do, but his body wept. With my mind, I was all prepared for my mother's death. With my mind, I could deal with it rationally. With my mind, I could work all that out. But at the moment of her death, muscles changed, tear ducts began to flow, my face began to contort, my body had to weep in the face of death. Jesus did exactly the same thing. Knowing everything he knew, believing everything he believed, knowing his plan, knowing his intent, knowing how he was going to carry it on through, his mind was fully in control. But his body had to weep. It was a response to the grief, the pain, the suffering, the hurt, the fear of all those people around him, that he responded as a normal human being would respond. And it's funny, you might tend to think that the fact that I am weeping or I'm brokenhearted and the tears are rolling down my face would suggest that I have no faith. That's silly. That is absolutely silly. Because Jesus, how could anyone have more knowledge, much less faith, of the circumstances? He had deliberately stayed away and allowed the man to die. On purpose. He had stayed away long enough so the man's body would have begun to rot. On purpose. And yet, when he was there with the sisters and with the man he loved, he wept. To me, it's one of the greatest examples in the Bible of the humanity of Jesus, and that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, fully, completely, absolutely in the flesh, and was subject to every temptation that you and I are subject to. He had the passions that you and I have. He had all the hormones flowing through his body, all the way out to the point to where when someone he loved died, his body would take over and he would weep. Then said the Jews, "Behold how he loved him." Exactly. Exactly. The weeping and the mourning at the death of someone like this is an expression of love. It is an outpouring of love. It is all of the love has come into focus in one place at one time, and we weep. Weeping is a wonderful thing, really. It's a marvelous thing. It's one of the things that make us human. One of the things that make us real. One of the things that allow us to love and express our love in ways that transcend, I love you, which we tell people, or hey, you're a good buddy of mine, and it's good to be with you, and all the things that we say back and forth, never really express in a way that needs to be said. Behold how he loved him. And some of them said, couldn't this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, have caused that even this man should not have died? And Jesus, therefore, again, groaning in himself, came to the grave. You would really think, it's hard for me looking back on it to imagine. I would have sort of thought that going to the grave, I'd have been chuckling inside. I said, look at all these silly people. What are they going to think when I get through doing what I'm going to be doing? But that was not his reaction. He was still groaning within himself as he walked up to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of him that was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time he's stinking, because he's been dead for 4 days. Jesus said, didn't I say to you that if you would believe, you should see the glory of God? And she needed to say nothing more. So they took away the stone from the place where the stone dead was laid, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I knew that you hear me always, but because of the people who are standing here, I said it, so that they can believe that you sent me. This isn't me. It's not my doing, that it's yours. And when he had said this, a really short prayer, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth! And he that was dead walked out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes. As he laid there, his body began to restore. Flesh that had actually rotted away became pink and fresh. Blood began to course through his veins as his heart began to beat. He began to take deep breaths into his lungs, which were restored. His eyesight would have come back to him. He couldn't see anything, wrapped like he was. And he could hardly move because he was bound in grave clothes. But he had been summoned by Christ to come forth, and so he stood up and staggered out of that place. His face was bound with a napkin, and Jesus said to him, loose him and let him go. He wasn't raised to spiritual life. He wasn't turned into an angel or anything of the sort. He was restored completely as he was before, human, physical, and he would die again. But Jesus had demonstrated himself as the Lord of life, as the resurrection. When he said, I am the resurrection, he stepped up to the cave and demonstrated that he was the resurrection. There was no arrogance in Jesus, though. There wasn't a chuckling or I'll show you guys type of an attitude, but rather a very human grief, a very human weeping as he stood there. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. I should say so. I would think so. I mean, if you're a person who was there when Lazarus died, if you were among those who actually saw the body prepared for death, the spices and what have you laid around him, and had actually seen all the wrapping of it go 4 days ago, and you stuck this dead body in and rolled that thing across it 4 days ago, and he's been in there all this time. Now a man walks up and says, roll back the stone, says, Lazarus, come forth, and he walks out of the tomb. Why in the world would you not believe? That certainly comes as no surprise at all. When he had cried and Lazarus had come forth, he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. And Jesus said, loose him and let him go. So the Jews believed on him, but many of them went their ways to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. Now, right here, this whole story goes screwy. It just absolutely goes off the wall as far as I'm concerned. There were standing there at that time men who watched this whole episode, who saw Jesus come, saw Mary run up and grab him by the feet, cry and say, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't die. Oh, no, we don't want to move the stone back. He'll be stinking by now. We mustn't do that. And Jesus does it. They do it, and he calls out, Lazarus, come forth. These slimy little men saw a dead man come back to life and walk out of that cave. And what did they do? They ran and told the Pharisees. And I gather they ran and told them, not so much out of joy, look at what wonderful thing has happened, but like tattletales on a school ground who could not wait to go and tell someone what had happened so as to cause trouble or get trouble or to move things in their direction or do whatever it was that they wanted to do. Pettiness of people is something that is really hard sometimes to understand. And how people will concern themselves over trivia that can't possibly matter, a hill of beans, when they are in the presence of one who says, I am the resurrection. I am the life. He that believes in me and is alive will not die. Instead of sticking with him and learning from him and sitting at his feet, they had to go tell the Pharisees, who hated Jesus, had to tell him what he had done. And so they gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees in council, and they said, what are we going to do about this? This man does many miracles. If we let him alone, all men will believe on him. I think that was probably fair to say. If we let him alone, everybody's going to believe on him. Then what will happen? Well, the Romans will come and take away our place and our nation. They were in effect quislings, I think. They were holding office at the behest of Rome. They had been placed in those offices. They owed their jobs to Rome. They were loyal to Rome. They were subservient to Rome, and they feared very much what would happen if Jesus really turned out to be whom he said he was. And instead of rejoicing that a man was dead is now alive, instead of going to Jesus and saying, I don't know how to deal with this. Can you help me to understand what has happened here? They said they just could be only concerned about their place, their job, their position, their authority, and the fact that if this thing got any further out of hand, Rome would probably come down around their ears and they would lose, never thinking, never understanding that the Messiah was supposed to deliver them from Rome, free them from Rome, turn them loose and let them go. Apparently freedom was something they didn't really want. And maybe because in a free nation they would not have held office. You have to also think about that. One of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said to them, you know nothing at all. you bunch of ignorant characters. You don't even consider that it's expedient for us that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation would not perish. He spoke this not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for that nation. And here was a man who, the people standing there with him, heard his words saying, well, I think the smart thing to do here is that we better go ahead and get rid of this man. It's better that one man die than that the whole nation die. And so this is justification. Off they go from the high priest. But in truth, he was prophesying that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but that he should gather together in one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Jesus' death is not for that one nation, but for the children of God scattered abroad. Now, when John wrote that, what do you suppose he was thinking? Was he thinking about the children of God scattered abroad, let's say Issachar and Zebulun, Naphtali, Ephraim, Joseph and Manasseh, all these? Is that what he's talking about, the children of God scattered abroad? Perhaps so. I think an Israelite at the time would have been inclined to think that way. But the word nations really means Gentiles in their mind when they use the term that way. He said that he should gather in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. So Jesus is going to die for the nation, as the high priest said, but not for that nation only, but for those children of God scattered abroad wherever they may be in the world, and of whatever nationality, of whatever people, of whatever nation. And when I read that one of the things that Jesus must do and will do is to gather in one the children of God who are scattered abroad, it reveals something to me that I probably should have tumbled to a lot earlier, and while it's one of those things you kind of know but don't know. There is so much concern nowadays over the scattering and the fragmenting, the balkanization, if you will, of the Church of God. How that churches fragment away from the worldwide Church of God, and then they fragment and split into themselves, or they flake off little groups here and there. And the number of groups that are scattered all over the countryside, and perhaps all over the world by now for that matter, who were formerly members even of just the worldwide Church of God, much less the Church of God Seventh Day, and all the churches in that tradition down through the years that have fragmented and scattered. One wonders, and we get continuing questions coming from people about about, well, why can't we go to work and solve this problem and get these people back together and help these people to all work under one tent, one big tent of all God's people? I've told you before of the Church of God Seventh-day minister who asked me that question once. It was up in Calgary in Alberta. He was driving me to the airport, and he'd heard me do a Bible study, and he was asking me, why can't we, get together and get the Church of God Seventh-day and Garner Ted Armstrong and all, why can't we all get back together? And I told him, I said, well, I don't know that it's necessary, first of all, and I'm not even sure that it's desirable. Each of us has our own savor, our own flavor, our own tradition, our own approach to things, and we probably, if we tried to get together, would generate more heat than light by the friction that would exist between us, and we're probably better off just carrying on our work. Since that time, there has been still more fragmentation that has taken place over the years, and we get letters from time to time wondering, well, why can't you get together with this group, or why can't we sort these things out and work these difficulties out? From my perspective, where I sit, the answer seems so obvious that it's puzzling to me many times why people don't see it. That the feelings, the history behind all these things have created barriers between people that actually would take miracles in many cases to resolve and somehow work out. It is, I look at it and I ask God, well, what about this person or that person over there? And I'm almost like Peter and Jesus walking along, and Peter saying, do you love me? Well, yes, Lord, I love you. Feed my sheep. And, well, do you really love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Well, feed my lambs. And we get through all this, having been thoroughly kind of rebuked by Christ for my previous denials. I look around, here's John walking behind. I said, well, Lord, what about him? And he says, well, if I will that he tarry till I come, what's that to you? Feed my sheep. In other words, I've given you a job. You know what you're supposed to do. What are you doing looking over your shoulder wondering what he's doing? That's not your concern. That's my concern. Don't you know what you are supposed to do? Well, yes, Lord, I do. I got it. I have it. I'll do what I'm supposed to do. But in actual fact, that is what we have to do. And it is the pettiness that sometimes gets a hold of us, the smallness that gets a hold of us, that causes us to divide and to fragment. There is that prophecy back in Daniel that Mr. Ted Armstrong cited not long ago where he said that when God will have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, then, and it went on with other prophecies, which was sobering, to say the least, to think of the fact that is almost as though the power of the church is deliberately by God being distributed or scattered. And that, in many ways, also should not surprise us. Because I was convicted, frankly, in 1958 that the worldwide Church of God had gotten too big to be effective. Had gotten far too large to really be able to do the work of God effectively. I couldn't help but hearken back to the example of the time when God gave Gideon an army and they set out to deliver Israel from their enemies, to fight against their foes. And God said to Gideon, those who are with you are too many. I cannot deliver Israel with an army this large. And so he began to send people back by different criteria until he narrowed that army down to 300 people. And God finally said, well, now I've gotten you small enough that I can use you. I don't know what God is doing or why he's doing it the way he's doing it. All I know is what we have to do. And the one thing that is clear from this scripture is that the only one who can gather together in one all the children of God who are scattered abroad is Jesus. Nobody else can do it. No conferences that we can call or hold. No plans that we can make. No ecumenical movements that we can start. The best thing that all of us can do of whatever stripe we are is to do our job and do it well according to the light that Jesus Christ has given us. Then, from that day forth, they took counsel together for to put him to death. I really don't know how, I am speechless in the presence of this kind of fatuousness on men's part. It is almost impossible to get your mind around what this means. Here is a man who earlier healed a man who was born blind, and they wanted to kill him. And then he goes and raises a man who's been dead and in the grave for 4 days and brings him back to life. And what's their response? They want to kill him. They want to destroy him. And we sort of think that man really wants to see God. Man really wants to know God. Man really wants to know Jesus. Man really wants Jesus to come into his life. No, he doesn't. No. Jesus is dangerous. And consequently, their desire was simply to kill him. Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but he went thence into a country near to the wilderness, to a city called Ephraim, and there he continued with his disciples. It's a breaking point in the story, the testimony of John, of which this sermon is another in the series, before he gets into the Jews' Passover. And I'll be deferring some of this material until we get a little closer to Passover before I resume the John series. But I was so struck by this in relationship to what he said, what John himself would say later, that if anyone doesn't confess that Jesus has come in the flesh, he is not of God. That men seem to want to get rid of Jesus. They want to get rid of the idea of Jesus. And one even can see, to an extent, the idea of sort of merging Jesus into the Godhead so that he is not a person. He is a something or other that's a part of a Godhead that is a Trinity of God, as opposed to being a person. And yet he was a person to Lazarus. He was a person to Mary. He was a person to Martha. He was Jesus. He was not the impersonal Christ or anointed that could be a king or a priest or whatever. He was Jesus, whom they knew, whom they had prepared food for. They had fed him. He had stayed in their home and slept in their bedrooms overnight. They had changed his bedding the next day and washed it for him. They had followed him from place to place. They had seen him personally touch people. And they had seen him cry over the death of one that he loved, in the spirit of weeping with those that weep, as he might at another time rejoice with those that rejoiced. Someone said to me that, when you read the epistles, the rest of the New Testament, you hear a lot about Christ. And it's there, and all the doctrines there. Sometimes Paul's letters are hard to follow, a little convoluted. They're very theological, and they deal with theological precepts and concepts, and you work your way through those and you teach them. But when you come back to the gospel accounts, you come into contact with Jesus. A person, a real person, who talked to people, loved people, cared about people, and cried at the death of his friends. Oh, Jesus Christ came very much in the flesh, and he fully understands everything that you go through in your life.